4 years after World War II ended, 12 nations came together to form an alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. In the 75 years since the formation, NATO has grown to include 32 countries, with Finland and Sweden being the newest members to join amid the war in Ukraine. So joining us now with more on relations between allies and the future of NATO is Max Bergmann. He's the director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program and the Stewart Center in Eurasia Atlantic and Northern European Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. There we go. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
80 years ago, we saw this transatlantic cooperation of allied forces in Normandy. Does this same sort of relationship exist between Western leaders today?
I think it does, and I hope it remains. And I think one of the greatest tributes to, I think, what happened 80 years ago is to just look at Europe today. Anyone who goes to Europe sees a continent that is whole, free, and effectively at peace. There's now a war in Ukraine, but NATO, the formation of NATO enabled Europe to integrate, enabled Europe to form the European Union. And Europe today is prosperous and democratic in large part because of the sacrifices that were made 80 years ago by the men that stormed the beaches at Normandy. And then 5 years later, the U.S. had, I think, the wisdom to not come back, to not leave Europe behind, but to remain. And Europe had been a source of wars, of conflict that had dragged the United States in constantly. We were constantly worried about European invasion of our own soil. And in us staying has created peace in Europe, something that was deemed impossible for millennia. Was something that we achieved and that NATO helped achieve.
As you know, former President Donald Trump was openly critical of NATO, complaining about members not paying what he would call their fair share. And then more recently, he even encouraged Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want to allies who don't pay their fair share. What are the concerns for the alliance if Trump is reelected?
Well, there is a clear need for Europeans to spend more. And the good news is that they're doing that. The war in Ukraine has really been a wake-up call, and we're now seeing European defense spending rising with most members now above 2%. So that's fantastic news. The broader challenge is that European defense relies on the United States. And that's what we have wanted for the past 75 years, is for European countries to allow us to be the quarterback. And if we don't take the field, and if the quarterback doesn't take the field, you have a real problem. And so that is what is causing a lot of concern in Europe, that they're spending more, they have some capabilities, but they need us to quarterback the war effort if Europe were to go to war and to stand strong. And so it would create a lot of havoc if the United States were to pull out and pull back. And with Russia rearming and potentially giving weapons to other countries, as your previous report mentioned, the threat to Europe is at the highest it's been since the Cold War. So Europe is incredibly nervous about any decline in U.S. engagement and U.S. support.
And when you say 2%, that is invested in each country's own military. And yes, there is a range. A handful of countries investing more, some countries investing less. It all depends on your proximity, if you look at the map, to Russia, how important you think that investment is. Earlier today on ABC News played an interview with President Biden. I want to play a little sound. He's talking about Vladimir Putin.
He's not a decent man. He's a dictator, and he's going to make sure he holds this country together while still keeping this assault going. We're not talking about giving them weapons to strike Moscow, to strike the Kremlin, to strike just across the border where they're receiving significant fire from conventional weapons used by the Russians to go into Ukraine to kill Ukrainians.
Can we talk a little bit about the role that NATO plays now and the concerns and threats when, we hear Vladimir Putin talk about perhaps giving weapons to other countries who are perhaps closer to Western targets, and kind of making a comparison or a criticism of NATO's support of Ukraine, suggesting that if NATO gets involved in any way, then it could be sort of an opening to broaden to a broader war.
Look, the current situation is fairly tense between NATO, between the United States and Russia, that we are providing weapons to Ukraine, and Ukrainians are using that to take on the Russian forces that are occupying their territory. And the recent decision by the White House to enable Ukraine to strike Russian territory, I think, is an incredibly sensible one. It was timely. Russia is using its territory as a shield to launch bombs at Ukraine. However, this is a very tense moment where the White House, the president, has to thread the needle in providing Ukraine what it needs, but also preventing a potential broader escalation of this conflict. Russia has nuclear weapons, and that is something that we have to take into account. But I think the broader point that you make is that Russia's a threat, a grave threat, as long as Vladimir Putin remains in the Kremlin, and there's no sign that he has any inclination of going. So we need to prepare, and that's why Europeans are spending a lot more on defense, and that's why our commitment to NATO and to European security basically sends a signal: Russia, don't even think about trying anything. Don't even think about challenging European countries on your border in NATO or in the European Union. And I think that is a strong deterrent message, and something that means that we're going to have to be on guard about what Putin plans to do going forward, because we know he's an adversary, and he's an adversary that wants to not only undermine the United States, but also wants to undermine NATO and European unity.
All right, Max Bergmann, thank you so much.